I'm Hannah Clarke, 34 years old, and I had spent most of my life believing that silence was the safest way to survive family gatherings. But at that Thanksgiving dinner, my younger sister Lauren raised her glass and made me the punchline. The room filled with laughter, every face lit with amusement, and yet I sat frozen, wondering how many of them would still laugh if they knew who had paid for the food on their plates. For years, I had carried them quietly, hoping generosity might turn into acceptance. But that night, something inside me shifted. By the time the evening was over, I finally saw my place at that table for what it truly was. Before I go any further, let me know where you're listening from in the comments, and don't forget to like and subscribe if you've ever been the one expected to carry everyone else's weight in silence. Growing up, Lauren was always the center of our world. She had a voice that carried across every room, a confidence that drew people in, and parents who praised her as if she were sunlight itself. I, on the other hand, learned early that being the responsible one meant not needing attention. I filled my hours with books, computers, and part-time jobs, earning money before most kids my age even knew what a savings account was. My parents admired my discipline, but admiration isn't the same as love. Praise in our house was a limited resource, and it flowed almost entirely toward Lauren. Lauren's life unfolded in dazzling fragments, talent shows boyfriends who arrived like trophy semesters at college that drifted one into the next without any real direction. When she stumbled, there was always someone there to soften the fall, often with money I quietly supplied. My part in the family was more practical, less celebrated. I was the one who paid forgotten bills, covered emergencies, and filled in the cracks no one else wanted to see. Over time, I became the invisible structure holding everything together, and like most structures I was taken for granted. I kept telling myself it was temporary, that one day they would notice what I had done. Holidays made it harder to believe. Lauren loved the pageantry-matching outfits, family photos, dinners staged for social media. My role was always behind the curtain, making sure the lights stayed on and the food arrived hot. The gatherings were loud, filled with laughter and stories, but rarely did anyone pause to notice that I was part of the room. When they did, it was often with a joke at my expense, something about being too serious, too busy, or too wrapped up in work. One Thanksgiving in particular stood out in my memory. Lauren showed up with a new boyfriend, a man who managed to insult me within minutes of shaking my hand. My mother bustled to set another place at the table while my father chuckled at the man's jokes. Nobody asked me how I felt, and nobody seemed to notice that I hardly spoke a word all evening. Later that night, I wired money into Lauren's account because she had once again forgotten to pay her rent. I told myself that was just what family did, though. Deep down, I longed for even the smallest acknowledgement that I mattered too. Over the years, I absorbed each little jab with the same quiet endurance. "Don't work yourself into an early grave," Hannah Lauren would tease, or "money doesn't buy happiness." Once she gave me a novelty mug that read, "CEO of Being Lonely." Everyone laughed and I smiled as though it didn't sting, but the laughter left its mark. I was useful, dependable, and invisible. I stayed in that role because I thought that was the price of belonging. And so when Lauren stood at that rented farmhouse restaurant and raised her glass, her words didn't surprise me. It wasn't the insult that hurt most. It was the truth that had been there all along, spoken out loud where I couldn't ignore it. What came after that toast would change everything. The laughter from that Thanksgiving toast stayed with me long after the plates were cleared. I had seen their smiles, heard the easy chuckles, and felt the sting of being reduced to nothing more than a target for a joke. That night might have been the first time the words were said aloud, but it was far from the first time I had been quietly diminished. Over the years, the pattern had built itself in small, almost unnoticeable pieces, each one stacking higher until it became impossible to ignore. I had always been the dependable one, the person who showed up when someone needed help. When Lauren was in college and found herself behind on rent, it was me she called late at night, sobbing about how she couldn't face another eviction. I covered the bill without hesitation, sending money directly to her landlord so she wouldn't be out on the street. At the time, I told myself it was temporary, that once she found her footing, she would pay me back or at least remember what I had done. Instead, the years went by and she continued to stumble while I continued to reach into my pocket. One year, she arrived at Thanksgiving with a man she introduced as her boyfriend, a man who didn't bother to hide his disdain for me. Within minutes, he had made a comment about how I looked like I had married my work. My father laughed at the remark, my mother shook her head with a faint smile, and the moment passed as though it were harmless. What struck me more than the insult itself was the way nobody thought to defend me. That night, after everyone had gone to bed, Lauren pulled me aside to ask if I could loan her money for a photography business she had been dreaming about. I wrote her a check the next morning. The requests became part of the rhythm of my adulthood. A broken-down car 1 month, an unpaid medical bill the next. When my father slipped a disc and insurance didn't cover the full cost of the surgery, I quietly sent the difference to the hospital. When my mother's car broke down and she didn't want to trouble my father, I was the one who arranged for the repairs and sent her a check. Each time they accepted without question, and each time I told myself, this was love, this was family, this was how you earned a place at the table. But the jokes never stopped. Lauren liked to lace them into conversation as if they were harmless observations. She once told me not to work myself into an early grave as if my stability was something to mock. Another time she teased that I believed money was the only measure of worth. One Christmas she even handed me a mug that said CEO of Being Lonely, a gift that drew laughter from everyone at the table. I smiled as though it didn't hurt. But the truth was, I went home that night and tucked it into the back of a cabinet where I wouldn't have to see it again. I tried to convince myself the humor masked affection, that somewhere beneath the laughter was acknowledgement of all I had given. Yet when my cousin Mark spun his stories about getting lost in Rome, or when Uncle Dennis launched into another golf tale, the family leaned in with warmth and indulgence. My contributions weren't stories anyone wanted to hear. They were obligations they expected me to carry. That difference grew clearer with every passing year. There was one gift I never forgot, not because of what it was, but because of what it revealed. On my father's birthday, Lauren completely forgot to buy him anything. I had already ordered a custom leather watch engraved with their initials, and when it arrived, she let him believe it came from her. He beamed, telling her she was thoughtful beyond measure, while I sat silently across the table. She never corrected him, and I never did either. The moment passed, like so many others unnoticed, unspoken, yet it stayed with me. I kept track of what I spent, not because I needed to count the dollars, but because it gave me something tangible to hold on to when doubt crept in. The spreadsheet became a record of sacrifices that had never been acknowledged. Over 7 years, it showed nearly $50,000 in payments, rent, medical expenses, car repairs, vacations, and last-minute emergencies. The numbers stared back at me whenever I wondered if I was being too harsh, reminding me that I had already given more than enough. Still, none of them asked how I was doing. Not once did anyone call to check if I needed help or if I even wanted to continue giving. Instead, when I sent money, I was told I wasn't the emotional type, that I didn't know how to connect beyond sending checks. They laughed as though it were true. What they never understood was that I gave because I believed love meant showing up, because I thought responsibility meant staying quiet. It wasn't until that Thanksgiving toast that I realized what had really been happening. Lauren's words cut through all the years of justifications, all the quiet sacrifices, all the hope that one day they might see me differently. In that moment, I saw clearly that I wasn't a daughter or a sister in their eyes. I was a resource, a lifeline, a funding source they could draw from without consequence. And sitting there at the long farmhouse table, hearing the laughter ripple through the room, I knew something had shifted. I wasn't going to keep playing the role they had assigned to me. The jokes had stopped being funny, and the weight of all those years had finally reached its limit. What I chose to do next would silence the room in a way none of them expected. The restaurant was warm that night, the kind of place Lauren loved to choose for the sake of photographs. She had picked the menu, the wine, even the playlist that hummed softly beneath the chatter. I had covered the bill in advance the same way I had done for years. When she swept into the room late, her hair styled perfectly, and her dress catching every eye, the whole family rose to greet her. I stayed seated watching her embrace after embrace while I sipped at my glass. Dinner rolled on with the usual rhythm. Mark told a story about losing his way in Rome, exaggerating every turn until the table shook with laughter. Uncle Dennis added one of his golf tales, dragging it out long past the point of interest, but no one interrupted him. I kept my focus on my plate, counting how many glasses of wine Lauren had already enjoyed, knowing she always grew bolder as the evening wore on. By the time dessert was carried in, the room had settled into a comfortable hum. The lights dimmed, candles flickered, and conversation dropped to a low murmur. Then Lauren stood. She raised her glass, smiling as though she had rehearsed every word. Her voice was warm at first, speaking of memories of love, of family standing together through everything. She paused for just a moment, letting the weight of her words settle. Then she added, "Except for Hannah, of course, the failure who thinks money makes her worth something." Laughter filled the room. Not a nervous chuckle, not silence broken by awkward coughs, but real, unguarded laughter. My father smiled faintly. My mother glanced at me but said nothing, and several cousins lowered their eyes to their plates without speaking up. I didn't feel my hands shake or my pulse quicken. Inside it was strangely quiet, as though the power had gone out and left me standing in stillness. I lifted my own glass, not wine but water, and spoke just loud enough to be heard. "To the failure who just stopped paying for everything you own." The words hung in the air like a bell that refused to fade. Silverware froze. A cousin's glass tilted but didn't fall. Even the servers paused in the doorway, unsure whether to move forward. I nodded toward the manager waiting by the door with the check. "That one's on you, Lauren." The silence stretched longer than the laughter had. Lauren blinked, stunned, before her expression hardened. My father straightened in his chair. My mother whispered my name as if I had been the one to cross a line. But I didn't raise my voice or look around for support. I had drawn a boundary, and this time I would not erase it. The meal ended abruptly. Plates were cleared, dessert was forgotten, and the polite smiles of the staff looked tighter than before. My family drifted from the room in uneven steps, whispering to each other, but not to me. Lauren stormed out first, her heels striking the floor with every step. My parents avoided my eyes, moving quickly toward the exit. In the end, I stayed behind, settling the bill myself, not because I wanted to keep playing the part they expected, but because I needed the night to close cleanly. I wasn't going to give them a reason to say I had been petty. By the time I returned home, my phone was already alive with messages. My father's text arrived first. "That wasn't fair, Hannah. You blindsided everyone. This isn't how we handle things in this family." Then came a voicemail from my mother, her voice soft and pleading. "Sweetheart, Lauren was joking. Don't let one comment undo years of love. Let's meet for lunch, just the two of us." Lauren's words came sharpest. 3 texts in a row. "You embarrassed me. Grow up. You're not a victim. Hope your money keeps you warm." I didn't answer. Instead, I opened my laptop and pulled up the spreadsheet that had lived quietly in my files for years. Every rent payment, every repair, every holiday or forgotten bill was listed neatly in rows, the total climbing to nearly $50,000. I attached the document to an email and sent it with no words in the body, only a subject line in case you forgot. Hours later, Lauren replied, "Wow, you really are that insecure. Congrats. You want a medal?" I closed the message without finishing it. The next morning, my mother called again, leaving another voicemail. "This isn't like you, Hannah. You're hurt, I know, but don't make permanent decisions over something said in the moment. That's not who you are." But the truth was, the decision wasn't about the moment at all. It was about years of moments stacked one upon another until the weight became impossible to carry. I was finished justifying every slight and calling it love. The calls and messages kept coming. Lauren's boyfriend sent a note on social media accusing me of humiliating her. I hadn't even known he followed me. The words slid past me like echoes in an empty room. I thought maybe the silence would bring relief, but what arrived instead was something different, a sense of breathing for the first time. That was when I noticed the bank account. It was one I had opened years earlier to help my mother with household expenses. When I checked the balance, I found withdrawals. I hadn't made grocery charges, boutique purchases, even a spa visit. The names on the statements traced back to Lauren. Even after the toast, after the spreadsheet, after the silence, she had kept drawing from me as though nothing had changed. I shut down the account that night, and as I closed the laptop, I realized the truth. I hadn't made a scene at Thanksgiving. They had. All I had done was stop playing along. The days that followed grew quieter. Calls went unanswered, group chats went by without my name. My absence seemed to fold into the space I had always occupied invisibly, only now the weight of it was missing. For the first time in years, the silence felt less like punishment and more like oxygen. But just as I was settling into that fragile calm, an envelope appeared at my door. Plain cream-colored, my name written in shaky black ink. The handwriting was my father's. Inside, I found something that would change the course of everything that came next. The envelope had no return address, only my name written in shaky ink. My father's handwriting had grown unsteady in recent years, but it was still unmistakable. Inside was a small stack of papers, some printed, some photocopied, and on top a short note clipped with a paperclip. His words were brief. "We've made mistakes. I've made mistakes. You need to know what's going on." I didn't know where else to turn. I spread the papers across my kitchen table, a mug of tea cooling beside me. The first page was a bank statement for a joint account my parents shared. Line after line showed withdrawals marked with Lauren's name, sometimes through transfers, sometimes cash pulled directly from ATMs. The amounts varied, but the pattern was clear. Hundreds one week, thousands the next, always steady, always draining. Some transactions were labeled emergency, but the purchases didn't match. I recognized boutique stores, weekend rentals, even restaurants she liked to brag about online. The next set of pages were emails between my father and their financial advisor. In one, he admitted they might need to refinance the house if the spending continued. He wrote that he hadn't realized how far behind they were, that he had tried talking to Lauren, but she brushed him off. One line stopped me in place. "Hannah can't know. She's done enough already." I read it twice, the words sharp in their simplicity. It was the closest thing I had ever seen to recognition, and it hadn't even been said to me. The deeper I went, the heavier it became. I had always known my giving was one-sided, but I hadn't understood how far it reached. My parents' home, the one they had always boasted of paying off years ago, was now tied up in debt they had taken on to keep Lauren afloat. She had not only leaned on me, but had bled their resources dry too. The house I had grown up in was no longer secure. It was slipping away piece by piece. That night, I sat staring at the documents until the lines blurred. For years, I had believed silence meant peace, that carrying the burden without complaint was what kept our family together. Yet here it was laid out in black and white silence, had only deepened the damage. I wasn't just funding my sister's life. I had been a pillar holding up everyone, and the structure was crumbling. The following morning, I made an appointment with an attorney. Her name was Marissa Adler, a woman in her 40s with a sharp gaze and a voice that wasted no words. She had helped a friend of mine set up a trust during a divorce, and I remembered how steady my friend had sounded after working with her. Sitting across from Marissa's desk, I explained everything the money I had given Lauren, the documents my father had sent the house on the line. She listened without interrupting, only tapping her pen lightly against a pad of paper. When I finished, she leaned back in her chair. "What you've described isn't just financial strain," she said evenly. "It's dependency. It's been built reinforced, and you've been the one propping it up. If you want to stop, it has to be structural, not emotional, legal." Her words settled over me. For the first time, I realized I wasn't looking for revenge or control. I simply wanted to stop being the foundation everyone stood on without ever checking if I was still there. Marissa outlined a plan precise and clear. Step 1. Purchase the family home through a private trust, ensuring my parents could remain in it for life, but locking it against future loans or transfers. Step 2. Cover the debts with a portion of my investments, not as handouts, but with documented agreements and legal signatures. Step 3. Exclude Lauren completely from any access, removing the possibility of her draining resources again. Marissa's tone was firm but not unkind. "If you follow through," she said, "you'll be protecting them, but you'll also be protecting yourself. Boundaries aren't spoken, they're enforced." I walked out of her office into the cold afternoon air, feeling different than I had in years. Not lighter exactly, but clearer. For the first time, there was a way forward that didn't involve silence or sacrifice. That week, I moved quickly. I arranged the transfer of funds, signed the first draft of the trust documents, and began clearing the debts that had been hanging over my parents. Each step was recorded, notarized, and filed properly. No quiet wires, no secret checks tucked into envelopes, no conversations smoothed over with half-truths. Every dollar was accounted for, and every signature was tied to responsibility. When the final paperwork was ready, I sent my parents a letter. It was short, without emotion, just the facts. They would not lose their home. They would be allowed to live there as long as they chose, but they would no longer be able to borrow against it or pass control of it to anyone else. "This is not a punishment," the letter said. "It is a boundary." I didn't hear from my father after that. My mother called, leaving messages that wavered between gratitude and guilt. Lauren sent a single text, "You've lost your mind." I didn't respond to any of them. For once, I didn't feel the need to explain or defend. The boundary had been set. Later that week, I met my parents at Marissa's office to finalize the documents. They looked older than I remembered, their faces drawn and tired as they signed each page. My mother whispered thank you as she slid the final sheet forward. I nodded, nothing more. There were no hugs, no reconciliations, just ink on paper and the quiet weight of change. Lauren didn't come. I hadn't expected her to. That night, I sat at my kitchen table again, the final deed in hand. For the first time, the responsibility didn't live in my chest. It was written in contracts, bound in rules, and separated from me. I wasn't the safety net anymore. I had become the architect of my own boundary. And yet, even as the weight shifted, I knew the story with Lauren wasn't finished. She had always found a way back into the center of the room, no matter how far she had fallen. I had no idea when she would show up, only that she would. It was a Sunday afternoon when she showed up. The sky was gray wind cutting across the street, the kind of day that makes everything feel a little heavier. I heard 3 quick knocks at the door sharp and spaced just enough to feel deliberate. I didn't need to check the peephole to know it was Lauren. She stood there in an oversized hoodie, her hair pulled into a knot that looked more forgotten than styled. There was no makeup, no smile, no attempt to pretend this was casual. I opened the door halfway. She stepped in before I could say anything, brushing past like the space still belonged to her. "We need to talk," she said, folding her arms across her chest. I nodded and stepped aside, closing the door behind her. She moved into the living room without waiting for an invitation, turning slowly like she was trying to find the right angle to start. "So that's it," she said finally. "You just buy the house. Cut everyone out." I didn't answer right away. I wanted to see where she was going. She kept talking, her voice climbing just slightly. "Do you even realize what this makes you look like? You're acting like some kind of power-hungry control freak who thinks money fixes everything." I raised an eyebrow and kept my voice even. "I'm not fixing anything, Lauren. I'm protecting what you kept breaking." She blinked at that, but didn't flinch. "I didn't know Dad was taking out loans," she said quickly. That wasn't me. I stepped around the coffee table and picked up the folder Marissa had prepared. I held it out, flipping it open to the 4th page. "Transfers in your name. Regular. Large." I paused, letting the weight of the words settle before I added, "Don't insult me by pretending you didn't know." She didn't reach for the papers. She looked at them like they might catch fire. "You could have told me," she said softer this time. "I did," I said. "Every time I bailed you out. Every time I covered your rent or your credit card. You just didn't hear me because I never yelled." Her mouth tightened. "So what now?" she asked, folding her arms tighter. "You're done with me. Just like that." I shook my head. "No, you were done with me the moment you stood up at Thanksgiving and made me the joke. That was your decision, not mine." She opened her mouth, then closed it again. Her eyes were bright, but not from apology, more like something else. "It was a joke," she muttered. "No," I said quietly. "It was the truth. Your truth. You just said it out loud." She looked away, jaw tight. "So what now?" she repeated. "You get to play hero while I get tossed aside." "No," I said. "You get to start over. From the ground. Just like I did." She stared at me, and for a moment I saw the panic underneath her defiance. "You're really cutting me off," she said. I nodded. "Not out of spite, out of survival." Her voice cracked. "What do I even have left?" I met her eyes. "Whatever you choose to build." She stood still for a long second, then turned. No slam of the door, no final insult. Just her footsteps fading down the hallway. I stayed where I was until the quiet settled. Then I sat down, not because I was overwhelmed, but because something had finally ended. For the first time in my life, I didn't feel guilty after she left. I felt still. 2 weeks later, we met again, but not by choice. My parents had come to Marissa's office to sign the final paperwork. The trust was active, the debt settled, and everything had been moved into place. The only thing left was formality. My parents looked tired, older than before. My father held a pen with fingers that trembled slightly. My mother kept her eyes on the papers, saying little as each document was passed from one side of the table to the other. When she handed me the last signed page, she finally spoke. "You didn't have to do this," she said softly. I looked at her and replied, "No, I didn't." There were no hugs, no reassurances, just finished signatures, a handshake from Marissa, and a quiet departure. I left before they did, stepping out into the cold with a file tucked under my arm, and no need to look back. That night, I poured a glass of wine and sat at my kitchen table again. The deed sat next to me, signed and final. The weight I had carried for so long wasn't gone, but it had shifted. It no longer lived in my body. It lived in documents, in decisions, in distance. I wasn't the support beam anymore. I had built something of my own. But even with the trust secured and the family house locked down, something told me Lauren wouldn't stay quiet for long. There was always one more attempt, one more door she might try to open. And when she did, I would be ready. 3 weeks after Lauren walked out of my apartment, the trust became official. The title to the house was transferred, the remaining debts were cleared, and everything was finalized under the new terms. My parents signed what they needed to sign without ceremony, seated at Marissa's desk, with their reading glasses perched low and their hands folded in stillness. There were no speeches, no apologies, just initial signatures and a kind of tired acceptance that hung between us. My mother handed me the last page and murmured, "You didn't have to do this." I met her eyes for just a second and replied, "No, I didn't." Then I stood, nodded once to Marissa, and left the room. I didn't wait for a thank you. I didn't stay for the ride home. Over the next few days, I put the final systems in place. A modest monthly stipend was arranged for my parents, enough to cover their needs, but not enough to be passed along to Lauren. The trust had clear protections. If she ever tried to access the funds, the account would lock. Marissa brought in an independent trustee to manage distributions going forward so I could step away completely. No more texts asking for rent, no more quiet phone calls about emergencies, no more blurred lines. Lauren didn't reach out again, not directly. I heard through Mark that she was living on the other side of town with a friend staying in a spare bedroom and trying to hold down a job as a retail stylist. He said she quit after a week, something about the manager being condescending. It sounded familiar. I didn't ask for more. That Christmas, an envelope arrived. No wrapping paper, no package, just a card in a plain white sleeve. Inside was one sentence written in my mother's handwriting. "We didn't deserve your grace, but thank you anyway." I sat with it in my hands for a long time. Then I filed it away, not out of bitterness, but because I had run out of space to carry things that didn't change anything. It was late afternoon when I stepped outside for a walk. The sky was gray, the cold biting at my cheeks, but I didn't mind it. I passed storefronts dressed in garlands, saw children holding their parents' hands, and watched a young couple laugh as they crossed the street with shopping bags in hand. For the first time in a long time, I wasn't behind on anything. I wasn't covering a quiet emergency or wondering which relative had borrowed against my silence. My phone didn't buzz with family group chats, and there was no obligation waiting in the wings. The routine I built after that was quiet. My mornings weren't rushed. I ate when I was hungry, walked when I needed air, worked without distractions. I didn't send flowers on birthdays. I didn't send cards out of guilt. I stopped reaching out first. I stopped sharing updates, and no one seemed to notice. We still spoke sometimes. My mother would call every few weeks, always with a soft voice and a careful tone. My father left brief voicemails on holidays, the kind that ended in a sentence or two. Lauren stayed silent. That silence no longer felt like punishment. It felt like distance earned and necessary. The weight that used to press against my ribs had lifted, not because everything had healed, but because I wasn't carrying the damage anymore. It was written into documents, protected by law, bound by terms I didn't have to explain. Sometimes people ask if we ever reconciled, if Lauren and I sat down and talked it out, if we found our way back to being sisters. I usually pause, then say something polite, but the truth is simpler than that. Lauren doesn't have a seat at my table anymore, not because I'm cruel, but because she burned hers and I stopped rebuilding it. It was late January when the final confirmations came through. The trust account had been fully activated, the distributions were on schedule, and the house, our family's house, was now protected under its new title. Everything was legal, final, and filed away. I hadn't spoken to Lauren since the day she left my apartment, but I heard she had moved out of her friend's place and into a short-term sublet closer to downtown. Word came through my mother passed delicately during a short call that never mentioned the trust or the documents she'd signed. She asked how I was sleeping. I said, "Better." She didn't press. There was no official announcement about the changes I'd made, no group message, no family meeting. I didn't send an update and no one requested one, but I could feel the shift in the air. The calls were fewer, the questions more careful. My absence from the usual birthday dinners and family chats no longer raised alarms. It was as if they all understood the rules had changed. One afternoon, I walked past a coffee shop near the courthouse where Marissa's office was. Through the window, I saw my parents seated at a table, both leaning in over a newspaper, not speaking. My father's coat was folded over the back of his chair. My mother was stirring her tea long after the sugar had dissolved. I didn't go in. I stood for a moment, then kept walking. A few days later, I received a letter in the mail not from them, but from the trustee. It was routine confirming that the monthly distributions had been sent and that the trust's restrictions remained secure. It wasn't the kind of letter most people would keep, but I did. I slid it into a folder in my desk drawer, the same one that held my ledger, the deed, and the only Christmas card my mother had sent me in years. I wasn't angry anymore. I wasn't waiting for an apology either. There was nothing left to prove. The justice I had been owed wasn't something loud or dramatic. It was this quiet, structured, enforceable. That spring, I stopped by the house. I hadn't been there since the documents were signed. My key still worked, but I knocked anyway. My father opened the door, looking smaller than I remembered. He stepped aside without saying anything, letting me pass into the living room where everything looked the same. The framed photos, the worn couch, the rug that used to bunch in the corner, unchanged. My mother was in the kitchen, her hands wet with soap, as she turned at the sound of my footsteps. "You didn't have to knock," she said. "I know," I replied. We didn't sit. I didn't take off my coat. I asked if the payments were arriving on time. My father nodded. My mother said, "It's more than enough." She paused, drying her hands on a towel. "We're managing." I told them I was glad. Then I said I had to go. As I reached for the door, my father asked, "Have you heard from her?" "No," I said. He hesitated, then added, "We haven't either. I didn't ask for details. I didn't offer guesses." I nodded once, said goodbye, and stepped back out into the sun. That night I cooked dinner slowly, not out of distraction, but because I had the time. No deadlines, no bank alerts, no missed calls or unsent invoices, just the quiet of my own kitchen and the sound of the pot simmering. After I ate, I pulled the folder from my drawer. I laid everything out, the trust letter, the ledger, the deed, the card. I didn't read any of it. I just looked at it all lined up like a timeline. The years I had spent giving without limits, the moment I had stopped, the lines I had drawn and never erased. Then I packed it all away again, sealed the folder, and placed it back in the drawer. The justice wasn't in the confrontation. It wasn't in a public reckoning or a family explosion. It was in the shift of power, quiet, complete, and irreversible. And though Lauren hadn't said a word since that day in my apartment, her silence spoke louder than anything she could have written. Spring turned to summer, the kind of warm, quiet days where time doesn't rush you. I found myself settling into a rhythm that felt unfamiliar, but not in a bad way. There were no emergencies, no hushed phone calls, no shifting calendar around someone else's needs. I kept to my routine. Work in the mornings, walks in the afternoons, evenings spent with a book or a quiet meal. The silence that used to feel heavy now felt like air still open mine. We still spoke sometimes. My mother called on my birthday. She kept the conversation short but kind. My father sent a card in the mail. It had no message beyond his name. I didn't take it as distance. I took it as what it was, what they were capable of offering, and what I was no longer begging to receive. Lauren never reached out again. Not a call, not a message, not even a second-hand update from Mark. I don't know where she went or how she's living. I've stopped checking. I used to think closure came from confrontation, from someone admitting they were wrong. But that's not always how healing works. Sometimes it comes from stopping the cycle. From stepping out of the story they keep rewriting and writing something else instead. For me, that meant boundaries. That meant silence I chose, not silence I was trapped in. It meant protecting my peace instead of protecting their comfort. I didn't destroy the family. I didn't set fire to anything. I just stopped handing over the matches. There's a photo on my bookshelf, one from a birthday years ago. We're all in it. Me, Lauren, our parents, everyone's smiling. I used to look at that picture and feel like the extra piece. Now I look at it and see the proof. I was always there. I always showed up. But now I show up for myself. If any part of this story sounds like your own, if you've carried others far past your strength, know this: walking away isn't failure. Sometimes it's the most generous thing you can do. Thank you for listening. If you've been through something similar, I hope you'll share it in the comments. And if this story stayed with you, I hope you'll join me again next time.